step into the shadows of a forgotten chapter in American history, a time when freedom was denied and humanity was stripped away in the name of profit. In this episode, we confront the harsh truths of a system that reduced people to property and controlled every aspect of their lives. The story you are about to hear is not easy, but it is necessary. In the early years of the American South, enslaved African men, women, and children lived under constant fear, their bodies and minds trapped in an unrelenting cycle of exploitation. This was not just about forced labor in fields under the hot southern sun. Behind doors, in the silence of candle-lit rooms and the isolation of backwoods cabins, a more insidious form of control took root, one that sought to dominate not just their bodies, but their very existence. There were no rights for those held in bondage. There was no safety from violence, no protection from the whims of their enslavers. Every aspect of life, love, family, hope was under threat. Children could be taken. Women could be forced to bear children against their will. Men could be broken in body and spirit to send a message to others. Yet, in the face of such darkness, there was resistance, there was resilience, and there were stories of survival, of silent rebellion, and of enduring humanity. These are the stories that history often avoids. But today, we choose to tell them, not to dwell in sorrow, but to honor those who lived through it, and to ensure that their truths are never erased. If you believe in uncovering untold history, in listening to voices that were long silenced, then we invite you to join us. Like this video to help others discover these powerful stories, and subscribe to our channel so you do not miss the next episode in this important series. What you are about to witness is not just a look into the past, it is a reflection of how history shapes us today. Let's begin. The horrors of enslavement in the United States extended far beyond the visible chains and backbreaking labor that dominate popular imagery. Beneath the surface of plantation life lay an insidious, deeply personal form of torment that left psychological scars generations deep. While the historical record has often focused on the physical labor and violence imposed upon enslaved people, it has too frequently silenced one of the most painful chapters: the widespread and systematic use of sexual violence as a tool of power, control, and dehumanization. Both black men and women endured this hidden war on their bodies and spirits, their pain often minimized or erased in traditional narratives. But the truth, raw and undeniable, persisted in their memories, passed down through whispered stories and fragments of resistance. It is these stories we must recover and retell with the care and weight they deserve. On plantations across the American South, enslaved women were especially vulnerable to the unrestrained power of slaveholders and overseers. These men, protected by law and supported by a society that saw black bodies as property, committed acts of coercion and abuse with impunity. Enslaved women were not only exploited for labor, but were also targeted for their reproductive capacity. Some were forced to bear children for the economic benefit of their owners, a cruel strategy that turned the very act of giving life into a calculated means of profit. They had no right to refuse, no legal recourse, no voice. Their suffering was not just individual, it was part of a deliberate system that commodified human existence. This system extended beyond individual acts of abuse to include forced reproduction programs where enslaved women were paired like animals with enslaved men selected by their so-called masters. These pairings had nothing to do with love or choice. They were strategic decisions to breed children who would be born into slavery, expanding the enslaver's human capital. In some cases, women were raped repeatedly, isolated from community and kin, and denied the most basic human dignity. And yet, their stories were too often left out of history books, as if acknowledging their trauma would reveal too much about the cruelty upon which the American economy once stood. Black men, too, suffered under the weight of sexual violence. Though their experiences have been less frequently documented, they were no less real. Men were assaulted by those in power, sometimes as a means of punishment, other times to destroy their sense of masculinity and control. Humiliation was part of the method, attacking not only the body but also the soul. Enslavers understood the psychological warfare they were waging. They knew that to truly dominate a person, you had to rob them of their autonomy and self-worth. Sexual violence was a weapon as powerful as any whip. What makes this reality all the more devastating is the silence that followed. The silence in courtrooms where victims had no rights. The silence in communities too terrorized to speak. And the silence in history books that skipped over these chapters in favor of narratives that made enslavement seem more bearable or less violent than it was. Even after emancipation, survivors of this violence rarely spoke of it openly. The trauma lingered in the background, shaping family structures, relationships, and a collective sense of memory. And the echoes of this trauma still ripple through society today. Understanding the full picture of American slavery requires confronting these painful truths. It demands that we honor the lives of those who were not only enslaved but violated in ways that history has too often ignored. This is not about sensationalism. It is about restoring dignity to those whose suffering was real, whose pain mattered, and whose stories deserve to be told not in whispers, but in full voice. These truths may be uncomfortable, but they are necessary if we are to truly understand the legacy of slavery and the ongoing struggle for justice. We must also recognize the resilience that existed in the face of such brutalization. Enslaved people found ways to resist, to protect one another, to love despite the attempts to control their bodies. They told stories, sang songs, passed down knowledge and culture in defiance of a system designed to erase them. Even when they could not speak freely, they found ways to communicate their truths. That legacy of resistance lives on, and so too must the commitment to remember their stories in full. As we delve deeper into this chapter of history, we invite you to stay with us to learn, reflect, and bear witness. These stories may be painful, but they are also powerful. They reveal the depths of human cruelty, yes, but also the strength of those who endured it. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, please support this journey by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing with others. Together, we can ensure that the silence ends here. In the grand plantation homes that dotted the American South, the image often evoked is one of elegance and civility: white women in flowing gowns, presiding over tea ceremonies and social gatherings. But beneath that carefully crafted image lay a far more complex and unsettling truth. These women were not mere bystanders to the brutal system of slavery. Contrary to popular depictions, many were deeply embedded in its structure, both as beneficiaries and enforcers of the very system that dehumanized thousands. Their complicity ran deeper than silence. It was an active participation that shaped the daily lives of the enslaved, particularly in the private, unspoken corners of the household. In many cases, white women inherited enslaved people as personal property, sometimes from their fathers, sometimes as part of their dowries. These human lives, handed down like silverware or furniture, became instruments of labor and subjugation, and often tools of power within the household. The domestic sphere, traditionally considered a woman's domain, was transformed into a site of cruelty, control, and sometimes horrifying intimacy. It was here that the power dynamic between white women and enslaved individuals unfolded with chilling nuance, less visible than the whip of the overseer, but no less damaging. These women exerted control in ways that were psychologically devastating. Some took pride in their ability to discipline or manipulate their slaves with a cold, calculated authority. Others used favoritism or withheld basic necessities: food, clothing, medical care, not as punishment but as a means to assert control and reinforce hierarchy. But one of the darkest corners of this dynamic was the role that some white women played in perpetuating sexual violence within their homes. While it is often men who are remembered as the perpetrators of sexual abuse on plantations, Many women were complicit in this violation of human dignity. In some cases, they coerced or facilitated sexual relations between enslaved individuals, particularly for the purpose of forced reproduction, aiming to increase their labor force without purchasing new slaves. Even more disturbing are the documented instances in which white women themselves engaged in sexual abuse. Sometimes this was driven by loneliness or a twisted sense of dominance. Other times, it was motivated by economic calculations. Breeding enslaved people was, after all, a form of investment. And while the historical record on such actions is often obscured or buried, survivor testimonies and court records occasionally reveal these uncomfortable truths. Enslaved men, in particular, lived with the constant threat of sexual coercion, not just from male slaveholders, but also from women who viewed their bodies as property to be used at will. What made this dynamic especially painful was the utter lack of recourse. An enslaved person had no legal rights, no bodily autonomy, no avenue for justice. Their humiliation was both intimate and public. It was common for white women to punish enslaved women they suspected of being involved willingly or not with their husbands. These punishments were not just physical. They were designed to strip the victim of any semblance of self-worth. Enslaved women might be dragged into the house to serve their mistresses while heavily pregnant. The child a product of rape. Their bodies became battlegrounds for jealousy, rage, and dominance, all under the cruel assumption that they had no voice and no humanity worth defending. This complicity among white women challenges the comforting myth of innocence. Many plantation mistresses were not passive victims of a patriarchal society, but active agents in maintaining and benefiting from slavery. They might not have written the laws, but they enforced them in their homes with a vigor that reveals just how deeply slavery was embedded into the social fabric. Their cruelty was often cloaked in the language of discipline and propriety, but it left scars just as deep as the overseer's lash. Yet, this part of history has often been omitted or softened in mainstream narratives. Schoolbooks rarely dwell on the darker roles of white women in the institution of slavery. Novels and films tend to paint them as tragic figures unhappy in marriage, trapped in societal expectation, unaware of the horrors around them. But the historical record suggests otherwise. Letters, diaries, and estate documents expose a more troubling portrait, one where women kept meticulous records of their slaves. Productivity, noted pregnancies, and calculated the future value of the children born from forced reproduction. To understand slavery in its full scope, we must confront these truths. However uncomfortable, the suffering endured by the enslaved was not confined to the brutality of the fields or the violence of the whip. It extended into the parlor rooms, the kitchens, and the bedrooms. It involved psychological torment as well as physical abuse. It was a system upheld not just by laws and governments, but by people, men and women, who chose to see human beings as tools for their advancement, comfort, and control. This reality demands more than acknowledgement. It calls for a retelling of history that does not look away from the complicity of those once considered morally exempt. By facing these uncomfortable aspects of the past, we allow for a more honest reckoning with the legacy of slavery, a legacy that still echoes in the inequalities and prejudices of today. Only through such reckoning can there be healing. After the United States formally banned the international slave trade in 1808, a new and deeply disturbing chapter began within the institution of American slavery. Without the option to import more enslaved people from abroad, slaveholders turned inward. They found a solution not by reevaluating the morality of slavery, but by manipulating life itself. Enslaved men and women were no longer just laborers, they became means of production. Human lives were managed like livestock, reduced to breeding stock for the sole purpose of sustaining and expanding the economic engine that slavery had become. Slaveholders began calculating the fertility of enslaved women with the cold precision of breeding animals. They tracked menstrual cycles, arranged pairings, and even offered incentives such as extra food or privileges for those who bore children. There was no regard for the desires, dignity, or consent of the people involved. A woman's value was no longer tied only to her ability to work the fields, but to her ability to produce more children who would be born into bondage, trained from infancy to serve, and eventually sold off or used as labor to continue feeding the system. This practice did not just grow out of economic necessity. It became institutionalized and deeply normalized across many parts of the American South. Plantation records reveal the disturbing level of detail with which slaveholders documented pregnancies, births, and the quality of the children born. Some enslaved children were separated from their mothers at birth or in early childhood, sold to different owners to serve in other parts of the region. For many enslaved women, the trauma of giving birth was intertwined with the knowledge that their babies might be taken from them at any time. The emphasis on reproduction also gave rise to a twisted and deeply inhuman science of control. Slaveholders and overseers began to experiment with ways to ensure higher birth rates, sometimes manipulating diet, labor loads, or even spiritual practices. The goal was clear. More bodies meant more labor, and more labor meant more profit. Children were raised not with love and dreams for the future, but with discipline and the cold hand of expectation. From an early age, they were taught obedience, physical endurance, and the social order in which they were considered less than human. By the mid-19th century, some plantations became notorious for functioning as human breeding farms, places where the forced reproduction of enslaved people became the central purpose. These were not always vast fields filled with crops, but enclosed and secretive areas where every part of life was calculated around controlling birth and growth. The enslaved were evaluated for their physical traits, strength, and reproductive capacity. Families were often torn apart if it was deemed economically useful. Fathers were denied recognition. Mothers were stripped of authority. Brothers and sisters were forced into different homes. Or worse, made to forget their kinship entirely. Among the most disturbing aspects of this system was its quiet persistence. There were no dramatic proclamations or grand policies announcing this shift, just a gradual, chilling transformation of plantations into spaces where life itself was molded, sold, and consumed. The people subjected to this system resisted in quiet ways, through acts of defiance, the telling of family stories, or attempts to shield their children from the cruelest parts of their reality. But the overwhelming weight of the system often crushed even these small victories. Slave children, when sold, were often categorized by size and presumed future productivity. A boy with broad shoulders might be expected to become a strong field hand. A girl with delicate features might be trained for domestic service or worse, targeted for exploitation by her enslavers. The marketplace for children was particularly ruthless. In urban centers, advertisements listed their ages, strengths, and even projected value. Buyers inspected them as they would horses, checking teeth, examining limbs, and bargaining over price as though these were not human lives but items on a shelf. This transformation of the enslaved into a self-reproducing labor force revealed the brutal ingenuity of a system designed to adapt and endure. While the rest of the world moved, however, slowly toward abolition or reform, many in the American South doubled down, finding new ways to extract wealth and power from human suffering. They cloaked this cruelty in economic rationale, pretending it was simply the cost of maintaining their way of life. And yet, despite the horrors, many enslaved families held on to their sense of kinship, identity, and dignity. They told stories, sang songs, and passed on wisdom that defied the dehumanizing forces around them. In the face of systematic attempts to turn their bodies into tools of commerce, they affirmed their humanity again and again. they endured, not just as survivors of cruelty, but as quiet resistors of a system that tried to erase their existence from the future. The legacy of this era remains a scar on the conscience of a nation. It is not enough to acknowledge the brutality, it must be understood in its full complexity. The system was not sustained by faceless institutions alone, but by thousands of individuals who made choices every day, some to uphold it, others to endure it. The story of forced reproduction within slavery is a story of power and control, but also one of resilience and the enduring strength of human spirit. Even in the darkest of times, in the deep shadow of the American South, where cotton fields stretched beyond the horizon and the creaking of wagons marked the rhythm of daily life, an invisible economy pulsed beneath the surface, one that trafficked not just in labor, but in life itself. After the international slave trade was banned in 1808, the machinery of slavery did not slow. It evolved. With fewer enslaved Africans arriving on ships, plantation owners turned inward, seeking to sustain their labor force through the bodies of those they already held in bondage. Enslaved women, many of them teenagers or even younger, were coerced into motherhood not out of any sense of family or hope, but to generate new generations of laborers. The birth of a child did not bring celebration, but valuation. Babies were tallied like stock, seen not as human beings but as future field hands or house servants. Their worth was calculated from the moment they drew their first breath. But what happened behind the closed doors of cabins and barns was even darker. Enslaved men were forced through brutal threats, manipulation, and systemic violence to participate in acts that defied every human instinct. They were ordered to impregnate women chosen by their enslavers, sometimes even their own family members, their sisters, cousins, daughters. It was a cruelty that dismantled the core of human relationships, stripping away identity and dignity, reducing the most sacred bonds into tools of profit. There were no choices. To refuse was to risk everything. Men who showed reluctance or defiance were whipped, shackled, or even killed. In many cases, the punishment was made public, an example to others of what resistance would bring. The enslavers needed obedience not just in the fields, but in the most personal and intimate spaces of life. To them, every body was a vessel, a means to an end. The plantation economy demanded growth, and growth required births. Each child born into bondage represented more labor, more income, more wealth. Survivors of this system bore psychological scars that ran deeper than the lash. Families, when they could be formed, were fragile things, easily torn apart by the whims of a sale. A father might see his son sent to another plantation 2 counties away. A mother might be separated from her newborn before she had even recovered from childbirth. And yet, in the face of such horror, enslaved people still found ways to forge connection, to protect their children with stories, songs, and whispered dreams of freedom. Even when the system tried to strip away every element of humanity, many resisted by holding on to hope, by teaching the next generation to dream beyond the confines of the plantation. The forced breeding of enslaved people was not an open topic in polite Southern society. It was rarely written down in plantation ledgers. Yet it was understood. Enslavers prized women for their reproductive abilities, often boasting about the number of children a woman had birthed. Terms like breeding woman or stock child were spoken without shame, as though human lives were no more than numbers on a ledger. There were men who were designated as breeders, given certain privileges if they complied, while being watched carefully to ensure they remained useful. Their masculinity, their autonomy, their right to consent, none of it existed. The system made puppets of them, tied to the economic strings pulled by their owners. Many enslaved men bore the weight of shame for the roles they were forced to play. Some broke under the strain. Others, in quiet rebellion, would try to protect the women by refusing, knowing full well what it might cost them. These were acts of courage as much as any attempted escape or act of sabotage. History remembers the escapes and the revolts, but these smaller rebellions refusing to comply, shielding a loved one, whispering truth in the dark were just as brave. As years passed, the children born from these forced pairings became part of the endless cycle. By the time they were old enough to walk, they were put to work, trained to obey, to submit, to survive. Their understanding of family was shaped not by stability, but by separation. Yet even in these conditions, bonds were formed. Elders passed down stories in secret, and songs became vessels of coded knowledge, ways to remember names, faces, places long lost to time and distance. What is perhaps most haunting is that much of this history was deliberately erased or ignored after emancipation. Records were sparse, voices were silenced, and generations of descendants were left to piece together their ancestry from scattered scraps. The pain inflicted did not end with slavery's legal abolition. It echoed through time, affecting families who had no words to describe what had happened to their ancestors. Only a lingering ache. Understanding this truth requires a willingness to look beyond the statistics and into the hearts of those who endured. It demands that we recognize the brutality of a system that corrupted even the most sacred aspects of life, family, love, birth. It is not simply a story of cruelty, but a story of resilience, of how people who were treated as less than human still found ways to affirm their humanity in the most impossible of circumstances. By the eve of the Civil War in 1860, the American South stood atop a dark empire built not on gold or oil, but on the bodies and lives of enslaved men, women, and children. In the eyes of the financial world, these human beings were not seen as fathers, daughters, or sons. They were assets, appraised and quantified like livestock or machinery. Their market value had soared to such staggering heights that, collectively, they were worth more than all the gold and silver held in the United States and all its fertile farmland combined. In a nation that preached freedom, the most valuable commodity was the ownership of human lives. Plantation owners, especially in the Deep South, understood this brutal arithmetic well. Enslaved people were not merely laborers. They were capital. Their ability to work, to reproduce, to be traded or mortgaged, turned them into the beating heart of a system that fed on its own cruelty. Southern banks issued loans backed by the presumed productivity of these enslaved individuals. Cotton brokers and landowners used them as collateral, securing debts and expanding their operations with confidence that the market for people would remain stable or grow. The bodies of the enslaved became instruments in financial speculation, bundled, insured, and traded in ways eerily similar to how mortgages would be packaged centuries later in the lead-up to the 2008 crash. This commodification extended far beyond American borders. European investors, eager to profit from the cotton boom and the rise of Southern prosperity, began funneling money into the U.S. economy through these human securities. In cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam, brokers viewed the American South as a lucrative frontier, backed by a seemingly endless supply of unpaid labor. Slave-backed securities were repackaged and sold overseas, binding foreign fortunes to the perpetuation of slavery. The wealth of entire families not only in Mississippi and Georgia, but also in Britain and France depended on the continued subjugation of millions. The result was a financial architecture built on forced labor, one so intertwined with the global economy that the dismantling of slavery posed a direct threat to international capital. The moral questions of abolition were weighed not only against tradition or politics, but also against the risk of market instability. For the Southern elite, emancipation was not just a loss of labor, it was a loss of billions in capital investment. Every enslaved person represented a line item on a ledger, a sum that could be borrowed against, sold, or passed down as inheritance. And this economic pressure only intensified the brutality of the system. The forced breeding of enslaved individuals was not just a practice rooted in cruelty, it was driven by cold, calculated profit. The value of an enslaved child, born into bondage, was added to the family's net worth. Women were often coerced into pregnancies not for the sake of family, but for business. Enslaved men were sometimes ordered to father children with multiple women, including their own relatives, tearing apart the most basic human bonds. Resistance to this practice was met with swift and often lethal punishment. It was a system that sought to break both body and spirit, turning human reproduction into economic output. Even enslaved children were not spared from the logic of capital. From the moment they could walk, they were categorized by potential labor value. Young girls were groomed for domestic work or, more horrifically, for future reproduction. Boys were set to the fields as soon as their bodies could endure the strain. And still, plantation records, bank documents, and insurance papers made no note of their names or stories, only their age, strength, and projected profitability. As this system expanded, its reach stretched into every corner of American society. Insurance companies in the North offered policies on enslaved people's lives, calculating payouts if a person died before repaying their value in labor. Northern textile mills thrived on cotton picked by enslaved hands, and banks from New York to Boston earned interest on slave-backed securities. The divide between North and South was never so clean. The economy of slavery was a national enterprise. By 1860, the enslaved population had grown to nearly 4 million, and their total value exceeded $3 billion, equivalent to over $90 billion today. This staggering figure was not just a measure of Southern wealth. It was a reflection of the systemic entrenchment of slavery in every aspect of American economic life. The nation's infrastructure, from its railways to its ports to its financial institutions, had been built, quite literally, on the backs of those it refused to recognize as fully human. To end such a system was not simply a matter of changing laws or declaring moral victories. It meant tearing out the foundation of a vast economic empire. The cost of abolition would be measured not just in lives lost on battlefields, but in the fortunes evaporated overnight, in the crumbling of banks, in the disintegration of entire business models. And perhaps that is why the resistance to ending slavery was so fierce, so desperate, because it was not just a war over ideology, but a war over who owned the very machinery of wealth in America. In the shadows of these financial transactions, in the quiet corners of ledgers and loan agreements, the voices of the enslaved were silenced. Their pain was never recorded, their families never accounted for, but their forced labor-funded cities educated generations and enriched empires, and long after the chains were broken, the wealth they generated continued to echo in bank vaults and university endowments, a legacy invisible to many, but carved deeply into the foundations of modern finance. In the booming cotton economy of the American South, the value of enslaved people grew so immense that they were no longer viewed solely as forced laborers in the fields. They became the backbone of the nation's financial system. By the mid-19th century, the wealth embedded in human lives had surpassed the total worth of the country's gold, silver, and farmland combined. This transformation did not just occur on plantations. It was carefully engineered in the boardrooms of banks and financial institutions, where people were appraised, categorized, and turned into instruments of investment. It was here that the cruel reality of commodification reached its peak. As these institutions began turning lives into numbers on balance sheets, collateral to be leveraged, risk assessed, and sold across oceans. What began as local transactions between slaveholders and banks soon evolved into a vast international system. In cities like New Orleans and Charleston, financial networks sprang up around this trade, with major banks offering loans secured by enslaved individuals. The mechanics were chilling in their precision. A plantation owner in need of capital could walk into a bank, Present an inventory of enslaved workers, each with an assigned market value based on age, skill, and health, and walk out with thousands of dollars. These human lives were itemized in ledgers, bundled into securities, and used to back bonds, much like real estate or industrial equipment would be used in modern finance. The bonds backed by enslaved people did not stay confined to southern soil. They were packaged and marketed by brokers, carrying the promise of stable returns tied to the productivity of cotton plantations. Investors in New York, London, Amsterdam, and even in nations where slavery was outlawed found themselves profiting from a system they ostensibly condemned. These financial instruments, essentially debt securities, allowed investors to buy into the wealth of southern slavery without ever setting foot in the region or seeing the brutality that fueled their returns. The system was intentionally abstracted, sanitized by distance and paperwork. Contracts bore no blood stains, and profits arrived clean in foreign bank accounts. Northern banks and insurance companies played a pivotal role in facilitating this trade. Firms like the predecessors of today's major financial institutions helped underwrite slave-backed securities, insured the lives of enslaved people, and extended credit lines to plantation owners. Some of these banks would grow to become financial giants in the modern world. Their early success intertwined with the mechanisms of human bondage. It was not just Southern wealth built on slavery, it was national wealth, and in some cases, global. These financial instruments grew in sophistication. Slaveholders could refinance their debts or roll them into new securities, using their assets to expand plantations, purchase more workers, and scale up production. An enslaved person, forcibly removed from family and freedom, could be used to guarantee a loan, then resold, then used to back yet another bond. The cycle repeated, with human lives caught in the gears of a financial machine that never slept. Every movement of the market echoed through the cabins and cotton fields, with changes in interest rates and commodity prices shaping the daily realities of those whose bodies backed the system. Even during times of economic downturn, the institution proved resilient. When cotton prices dipped, the enslaved were still considered valuable enough to uphold financial confidence. Like real estate during a housing crisis, the belief in their enduring value helped prop up markets. During the Panic of 1837, for instance, many banks collapsed, but those tied to slave-backed bonds managed to stay afloat longer, their ledgers bolstered by the forced labor that continued regardless of market fluctuations. Human suffering provided a grotesque kind of economic stability. In some cases, entire families were separated purely to maximize financial return. A mother and her children could be sold to different buyers not because of agricultural need, but because breaking the unit brought in more cash to secure a larger loan. Appraisers assigned dollar values to each person, and these numbers determined how bonds were structured and sold. The more productive or reliable the laborer, the higher the value assigned, and the greater the financial leverage offered by the bank. Human character, endurance, and suffering became data points in a larger economic formula. By the 1850s, financial newspapers reported on slave-backed bonds as routinely as they would later report on railroads or steel. Markets analyzed their performance. Investors tracked regional trends. Some abolitionists tried to expose this system, publishing pamphlets and editorials that traced the path from blood-soaked cotton fields to the drawing rooms of wealthy financiers in Europe. But by then, the machinery was entrenched. Slavery was no longer merely a social or moral institution, it was a transnational financial structure, deeply woven into the fabric of capitalism itself. This was not just about exploitation on plantations. It was about the deliberate design of a financial world that could run on human lives as fuel. It was about an economic model that did not merely tolerate injustice but profited from it, institutionalized it, and exported it globally under the guise of prosperity. And while the Civil War would ultimately dismantle the legal framework of slavery, the legacy of those bonds, both literal and metaphorical, continued to shape wealth and inequality. In the decades that followed, in the twisted fabric of America's past, there existed a terrifying intersection of race, power, and control, a system designed not only to exploit but to utterly dominate. Slavery did not end with chains. It morphed, adapted, and lingered, embedding itself into the social, financial, and psychological architecture of a nation. It did not stop with the auction blocks or the plantation fields. Its darkest corners existed where cruelty was masked as order and violence as discipline. Among these haunting truths, one of the most disturbing was the physical mutilation of black men, acts rooted not merely in punishment, but in symbolic annihilation. As slavery gave way to post-emancipation systems of control, the bodies of black men remained sites of trauma. Fear and fantasy collided in the minds of white supremacists who saw black masculinity as both threat and excuse. In countless towns across the South and sometimes beyond, black men were accused, often without evidence, of consorting with white women. These accusations, fueled by a toxic mix of racial mythologies and social panic, ignited violent outbursts that often led to horrific outcomes. In many cases, white mobs did not merely kill. They sought to humiliate. They castrated. These acts were not random. They followed a logic, however twisted, designed to send a message. Dominance must be total. If a black man was seen as stepping beyond the invisible boundaries imposed by a racially stratified society, the punishment would extend beyond death. Castration served a dual purpose. It removed what white supremacists considered a biological threat and served as a public spectacle of dehumanization. This was not justice. It was a ritualistic assertion of power. Newspapers often reported these events with disturbing casualness, sometimes even with pride. Lynchings were advertised in advance. Crowds gathered as if attending a fair. The brutal details: burnings, mutilations, hangings were not whispered in shame but recounted openly, as if to affirm a moral code no court would dare contest. Photographs of these spectacles were even turned into postcards, circulated among friends and family like grim souvenirs. These were not rogue events. They were part of a culture of terror that reinforced white dominance through repeated, ritualized violence. Behind each accusation was a story, a life, a family, a man with dreams and fears, torn apart by a lie or by stepping out of line. The myth of black male hypersexuality, born in slavery and perpetuated through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, was used to justify unthinkable brutality. It painted the black man as a lurking danger, even as he was the one most vulnerable to danger every time he stepped into a public space, looked at someone the wrong way, or simply existed. In reality, these men were teachers, fathers, soldiers, laborers, and yet their humanity was erased by a system that saw them as threats to be extinguished, not citizens to be protected. This pattern of violence must be understood within the broader context of how slavery and its legacies shaped the structures of power in America. From the time enslaved people were used as collateral to back financial instruments, bonds, bought and sold by investors across the globe, their value was quantified, not in humanity but economic terms. They were turned into assets. Their bodies were leveraged for profit, and when the formal institution of slavery ended, the logic of commodification did not disappear. It transformed. Instead of backing bank loans, black lives were used to uphold social hierarchies, manipulated to justify policing, incarceration, and economic exclusion. The legacy of mutilation, of castration, echoes in those structures. It is not only a historical fact, but a brutal symbol of the lengths to which systems of dominance will go to assert control. It tells us something about how fear can become a political tool, how violence can be wrapped in the language of morality, and how pain can be inflicted not only to silence but to terrorize entire communities into submission. Understanding this history demands that we face it not with morbid fascination, but with the clarity to recognize how deep its roots run. These were not isolated acts of rage. They were components of a larger machinery designed to reinforce a racial order. That machinery has been reshaped over time, made more subtle, more abstract. But its original blueprints remain etched into the story of America. For generations, these stories were silence buried under the weight of shame, denial, or indifference. But they must be told, not only for justice but for understanding. The struggle for equality has never been about simply rewriting laws or changing institutions. It has always been about reclaiming dignity, about acknowledging the full humanity of those who were once treated as disposable. And in doing so, perhaps we can begin to dismantle the legacy that allowed such horrors to exist in the first place. In the deep shadows of American history, the lives of enslaved people were marked not only by forced labor and stolen freedom, but also by violence that struck at the very core of their dignity and identity. One of the most disturbing and rarely discussed aspects of this brutal system was the deliberate and orchestrated use of sexual violence against enslaved men. These acts were not isolated incidents of cruelty, but part of a broader framework designed to destroy resistance, to assert dominance, and to humiliate, both physically and psychologically. In many plantations, the enslaved were watched closely, their every move scrutinized for signs of disobedience or rebellion. Any hint of defiance could bring about swift and merciless punishment. Yet some punishments were not just about discipline, they were about spectacle. They were about teaching a lesson, not only to the victim but to every man, woman, and child who was forced to witness it. It was within this context that the horrific practice of public sexualized violence emerged. Enslaved men, often young, strong, and seen as potential leaders within the enslaved community, were targeted. They were stripped of their clothes, dragged into the open, and subjected to assaults so degrading, so calculated in their cruelty, that even those accustomed to the horrors of slavery were left speechless. These acts were carried out by white enslavers or overseers, not in secret, but in front of other slaves. Other enslavers, even family members. The intention was clear: to emasculate, to dehumanize, and to fracture the social bonds within the enslaved population. By violating a man's body in such a public and humiliating way, the enslavers sent a message that no one was safe, that power could reach into the most intimate corners of a person's life, and that resistance would be met not just with death, but with utter destruction of one's manhood and honor. Some of these men had done nothing more than speak out of turn, attempt to escape, or be suspected, often without evidence, of expressing desire or affection for a white woman. In a society obsessed with controlling both black labor and black sexuality, the idea of a black man even looking at a white woman in a way deemed inappropriate could provoke violent retribution. These men became targets of a cruel mythology that painted them as threats to the racial order, especially when it came to white womanhood. That myth, rooted in fear and white supremacy, justified not just whippings and beatings, but also more sadistic punishments. One of the most disturbing aspects of this violence was that it was performative. The assaults were intended not just to punish but to traumatize. The enslavers understood the power of fear, and they weaponized it masterfully. When an enslaved man was attacked in this way, the witnesses, many of them his friends, his siblings, or even his children, were left deeply shaken. The trauma was not confined to the victim alone. It rippled through the community, weakening morale, silencing voices, and sowing distrust. These acts were never acknowledged in plantation records or discussed openly in polite white society. They remained buried beneath the official narratives of Southern honor and paternalism. But they lived on in whispered stories, in inherited memories passed down through generations, in the way some descendants still speak of a great-grandfather who never looked anyone in the eye again or never spoke of what happened that day. oral histories, collected many years later, would begin to shed light on this hidden side of slavery, revealing a system that did not just exploit bodies for labor, but sought to destroy souls through shame. This violence was part of a larger structure of control over time, over space, over labor, and over reproduction. Enslaved men were not only forced to work but were denied the right to protect their families, their bodies, or even their sense of self. In many, this was the ultimate form of domination, to strip a man not just of his freedom but of his ability to see himself as a protector, as a father, as a human being worthy of respect. And for the enslavers, this control reinforced their own position, not just as economic masters but as guardians of a racial and gendered hierarchy that had to be maintained at all costs. Today, historians and scholars continue to uncover these dark truths, piecing together fragments from testimony, court records, slave narratives, and oral histories. The full scope of this violence may never be known, but its legacy lingers in the collective memory of communities shaped by slavery's shadow. For too long, these stories have remained untold, dismissed as too uncomfortable or too shameful. Yet it is only by confronting them directly, by acknowledging the true extent of what was endured, that we can begin to understand the resilience of those who survived, and the terrible weight carried by those who did not. In telling this part of the story, we honor not only the pain, but also the courage of those who endured the unendurable. Their silence was never consent. Their suffering was never weakness. And their legacy is not one of defeat but of survival in the face of unimaginable cruelty. After the abolition of slavery, freedom was promised to millions who had known only chains and forced labor. But what followed was not liberation, it was transformation. The physical bonds may have been broken, yet the psychological and systemic shackles only grew more insidious. In the southern states, a dangerous myth began to fester, the image of the black male as a lurking predator, a menace to white womanhood. This narrative was not born from truth, but from a need to maintain white dominance in a society that now had to contend with the reality of black citizenship. It was fear dressed as morality, cloaked in the language of protection but steeped in the intention of control. As black men tried to exercise their new rights, voting, working for fair wages, building families and communities, this myth became a weapon. Every whisper of impropriety, every imagined glance or unfounded accusation, became grounds for violence. Lynchings were no longer rare acts of cruelty, they became public rituals, meant to terrorize and to remind an entire race of its place. Crowds would gather, often including families, children, and churchgoers, watching with a disturbing sense of righteousness as human beings were tortured and killed under the guise of justice. Newspapers would print stories that stoked fear and suspicion, ensuring that the myth endured across generations. Behind these spectacles of racial violence were organized forces. The Ku Klux Klan, which rose again with renewed energy after the Civil War, claimed to be the protectors of white civilization. Wearing hoods to mask their identities but never their intentions, they burned homes, threatened voters, and murdered anyone who dared to defy the old order. Their targets were not just black men accused of crimes, they were teachers, ministers, sharecroppers, businessmen, and veterans who symbolized the potential of black progress. The Klan's message was clear: freedom had its limits, and those limits would be violently enforced. But the myth of the black predator did not flourish on violence alone. It was fed by silence, complicity, and sometimes even open support from white women who had been raised to see themselves as the ultimate victims in a changing world. In newspapers and courtroom testimonies, their accusations often required no corroboration, and their words held the power to decide life or death. While many surely lived in fear themselves, trapped by their own lack of agency in a patriarchal society, others used this role as gatekeepers of racial purity to their advantage. In doing, They became active participants in the machinery of repression. Segregation laws soon codified these fears into daily life. Black people were forced to use separate facilities, attend separate schools, and live in separate neighborhoods. But this was never just about physical separation, it was about psychological subjugation. The myth justified every humiliation, every barrier, every unequal policy. If black men were portrayed as dangerous, then locking them out of the public sphere became a public service. If black families were seen as inherently immoral, then underfunding their schools or denying them housing became a moral imperative. And yet, within this environment of relentless hostility, black communities fought back not always with fists or protests, but with persistence. They built their own businesses, churches, schools, and social organizations. They told their stories in songs and sermons and poetry. Parents passed down lessons in dignity and survival. Leaders emerged from towns and tenements, calling not just for justice but for truth. They knew that the myth could not be dismantled by silence, it had to be confronted with courage. Still, the consequences of that lie of the fabricated black threat remain etched into the American landscape. Generations have grown up under its shadow, inheriting not only the pain it caused but the systems it shaped. Policing practices, prison policies, media representations, and public attitudes still bear the imprint of a narrative designed to dehumanize. To understand this chapter of history is not to indict individuals, but to expose the structure that sustained a cycle of fear and violence long after slavery ended. The story of what followed emancipation is not just one of progress, but of backlash, and at the heart of that backlash was a myth, a tool used to rob dignity, deny justice, and rationalize brutality. Only by facing it head-on and recognizing its echoes in our present can we begin to unravel its hold on the future. In the shadow of emancipation, a new chapter of American history began, one not of freedom fulfilled, but of a brutal reordering of power. The promise of liberty given to formerly enslaved people sparked not just hope, but also deep fear in those who had long benefited from the old order. For many white Southerners, particularly women who had held a socially revered yet dependent place in the slave-owning hierarchy, this upheaval represented a direct threat to their way of life. In response, they did not simply retreat into silence. Instead, they organized, they strategized, and, in chilling numbers, they mobilized. The women of the Ku Klux Klan, commonly known as the WAC, emerged as one of the most disturbing responses to the shifting racial dynamics of the post-Civil War South. While often overlooked in mainstream histories, their role was neither passive nor peripheral. These women formed their own branches, separate from the male-dominated Klan, and brought with them a distinctly domestic yet no less violent brand of activism. They organized rallies cloaked in the language of family and morality. But at their core, these gatherings aimed to reinforce white supremacy, thinly veiled as a defense of traditional values. These women understood the power of narrative. They spun stories of danger and virtue, often centered around the idea that white womanhood was under attack. The myth of the black male predator, so damaging and so persistent, became their weapon of choice. Through newspapers, pamphlets, and school lectures, they repeated false claims of black violence to stir up fear and justify repression. These fabricated tales often centered on accusations of sexual aggression, a grotesque distortion of reality that served to rationalize everything from segregation laws to vigilante violence. This myth was no accident. It was a deliberate, calculated story designed to reshape public opinion and restore racial hierarchies through emotional manipulation. Behind the scenes, WACC members were tireless organizers. They raised funds, recruited new members, and infiltrated civic institutions, pushing policies that aligned with their views. They presented themselves as protectors of community and family, masking the harm they inflicted on others as necessary for the greater good. They held parades, often dressed in white robes with hoods, their faces uncovered, unashamed. Their children marched beside them, learning the ideology by osmosis. These displays were not just performances, they were warnings to anyone who dared to challenge their vision of society. What makes the Wokik particularly chilling is not just their participation in hate, but their normalization of it. By presenting white supremacy as a wholesome, even feminine duty, they blurred the line between civic responsibility and racial hatred. The image of the gentle, nurturing woman became weaponized, used to justify exclusion, oppression, and in many cases, violence. And they were effective. Their influence helped push laws that denied Black Americans access to education, housing, and basic civil rights. They campaigned against interracial marriage and desegregation, painting such progress as a betrayal of American values. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their work was the subtlety with which it operated. While the case men often resorted to open intimidation, the women's influence crept through softer, more insidious channels: school boards, churches, parent-teacher associations. They did not always scream their ideology. Sometimes they whispered it, over tea and at church luncheons, embedding it into everyday life until it felt normal, even righteous. And always, beneath their rhetoric, pulsed a fear of loss of status, loss of control, loss of identity. Their activism was born from a desire to cling to a social structure in which they, too, had wielded a kind of power, albeit indirectly. For them, emancipation was not just the liberation of Black people. It was the unraveling of their own privileged place in the world. In response, they chose not to adapt, but to resist, not to reconcile, but to reclaim. They did not do this alone. Their efforts were bolstered by a broader culture that still held deeply entrenched views about race and gender. They found allies among politicians, journalists, and religious leaders who echoed their sentiments. In many towns, the lines between civic leadership and white supremacist activism blurred, and the Wokik stood at that dangerous intersection. As the 20th century progressed, the tactics of the Kik evolved, but their mission remained consistent: to guard a racial and social order that had always benefited them. They framed themselves not as aggressors but as defenders. Their legacy is not one of ignorance, but of willful participation in a system built on exclusion. They were not simply following men, they were leading their own campaigns, shaping a version of America that was orderly, controlled, and ruthlessly unequal. This chapter of history is uncomfortable, but it is essential. It reminds us that oppression does not always arrive in the form of violence or overt hate. Sometimes it wears a smile, a bonnet, and speaks the language of motherhood, morality, and tradition. The women of the Wokik were not anomalies. They were neighbors, teachers, and community leaders. They remind us that white supremacy was and often still is a communal project, not just a fringe ideology. And they force us to ask hard questions about the narratives we inherit and the roles we each play in shaping them. For generations, the history of slavery in America has been retold in fragments carefully edited, selectively remembered, and in many cases, deliberately whitewashed. The focus often rests on dates, legislation, and economic systems, while the lived experiences of millions are reduced to footnotes. Even more obscured are the deeply uncomfortable truths: the normalization of sexual violence, the active participation of white women, and the vast machinery of silence that followed. These elements, central to the fabric of American slavery, have been systematically scrubbed from mainstream education. The result is a national memory that is incomplete at best, and dangerously misleading at worst. The exploitation of enslaved black people, especially black women, was not just a byproduct of slavery, but a cornerstone of it. Their bodies were not only forced into labor, but were also commodified in the most intimate and brutal ways. Yet, in history books, their stories are rarely centered. Instead, narratives often shift toward the so-called benevolence of some slaveholders, or the slow progress of legal reform, glossing over the trauma endured by generations. White women, too, played roles that defy the passive, victimized image often portrayed in films and literature. While some may have been trapped by the constraints of their time, many were active agents in upholding and benefiting from slavery. They managed plantations, punished the enslaved, and, in many cases, turned a blind eye or worse to the sexual abuses that occurred in their own households. Their participation was not always overtly violent, but it was complicit, reinforcing a system built on domination and dehumanization. The most insidious part of this legacy is not just what happened in the past, but how effectively it has been hidden in plain sight. School curricula routinely skip over the brutal realities of plantation life, reducing slavery to an economic issue. Textbooks may mention the cruelty of forced labor, but seldom confront the horror of enslaved children being sold away from their mothers, or the way enslaved women were routinely subjected to reproductive violence. They do not explain how entire families were treated as breeding stock, or how generations of trauma were passed down because of state-sanctioned violation. This erasure has consequences. When a society refuses to confront its past, it loses the ability to understand its present. The legacies of slavery: systemic inequality, racial violence, and cultural amnesia did not vanish with emancipation. They evolved, finding new forms in the prison system, in discriminatory laws, in housing and education, and without an honest reckoning with what truly happened. Those legacies continue to shape lives today. That is why telling these stories matters. Not to dwell in shame, but to illuminate truth. The goal is not to cast blame on people living today, but to understand the systems we have inherited and to change them. History is not just something we study. It is something we live with, and if we do not challenge the myths, we end up repeating the mistakes. To those of you who stayed with us through this difficult journey, thank you. These are not easy topics, but they are essential. If you learned something new tonight, or if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to shine a light on the chapters of history too often kept in the shadows.